Imagine living behind an iron curtain, a land where books are censored, radios are controlled, and the government dictates what music you can hear. Now imagine a crack in that wall coming, not from tanks or politicians, but from 4 young men with guitars, mop-top haircuts, and songs about love. This is the story of how the Beatles, a band from Liverpool, became an unlikely weapon of cultural rebellion inside the Soviet Union, and how their music, smuggled across borders and whispered through scratched vinyl, helped shake the foundations of a superpower. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more hidden stories from history, and hit the bell icon so you never miss our deep dives into the past. Welcome to the Beatles and the Cold War. How music shook the Soviet Union. The Cold War wasn't just about missiles, spies, or political speeches. It was also a battle for hearts and minds, a fight over culture, ideology, and imagination. In the West, music was exploding. The 1960s gave birth to rock and roll, counterculture, and a spirit of rebellion. But in the Soviet Union, the state tightly controlled every form of art. Jazz, rock, or anything Western was viewed as corrupting, dangerous, an infection of capitalist decadence. Official Soviet music was patriotic, orchestral, safe. Songs glorified the worker, the soldier, the party. But youth in Moscow, Leningrad, and Kiev were not blind. They tuned into shortwave radios at night, straining to catch forbidden stations like Radio Luxembourg or Voice of America. And in those crackling airwaves, many of them heard something magical for the very first time. The Beatles. When the Beatles exploded onto the global stage in the early 1960s, their music spread like wildfire everywhere except the USSR. In USSR, their records were banned. No official shop would sell them, but scarcity made them even more desirable. A black market blossomed. Some ingenious fans created bone records, illegal recordings pressed onto discarded X-ray films. Imagine holding a faint image on X-ray of someone's broken ribcage. But when you put it on a record player, instead of silence, you hear songs like Yesterday or Back in the USSR. It was a ghostly rebellion. Music etched literally onto the skeleton of the people. These records passed hand to hand, whispered from friend to friend, and in smoky dorm rooms across the Soviet Union, teenagers fell in love with the forbidden sound of freedom. Why did the Beatles matter so much in the USSR? Because they represented more than just catchy tunes. Their music was joy in a gray world. Their style was freedom in a society of conformity. Their very existence was proof that another world was possible. For Soviet youth, the Beatles weren't just a band, they were a lifeline. They gave a glimpse of the West, of creativity unshackled. Some young Soviets even tried to imitate the Beatles' look, despite KGB officers harassing anyone with decadent Western haircuts. Listening to the song All You Need Is Love was a political act. Dancing to the song Twist and Shout was a form of protest. And singing along to the song Back in the USSR, ironically, was an act of delicious rebellion against the system itself. You bet the Soviet authorities caught wind of that. They were all over it. They definitely didn't find it funny at all. Not one bit. Cultural watchdogs denounced the Beatles as agents of capitalist corruption. Some newspapers went all out, writing scathing editorials about it being noise without meaning. They really didn't hold back. Some schools are actually punishing students for humming Western tunes. Can you believe that? But repression only fueled the hunger. Every time the party condemned the Beatles, their myth grew stronger. Young Soviets wanted them even more. The harder the state tried to silence the music, the louder it blared in the hearts of the people, echoing their spirit and passion. It was one of those classic Cold War twists. The harder the USSR pushed against Western culture, the more people wanted to dive right into it. By the 1970s, the Beatles had split up, but their vibe just kept growing in the US. Bootlegs were popping up everywhere, like they were on a wild treasure hunt. Young bands began jamming in garages, belting out their own catchy tunes in Russian, all while channeling that classic Beatles vibe. These underground rock groups totally sparked a cultural revolution, changing music and vibes forever. Soviet youth found something the party just couldn't give them: a real identity. A chance to say we exist, we feel, we want to be free. The authorities totally knew what was going on, right? They weren't blind to it. KGB files from back in the day reveal they were always watching rock clubs and Beatles fans. But by then, the tide was totally unstoppable, and nothing could change that. Music had already broken down the wall, setting the vibe and lifting spirits high. A lot of Soviets say their first encounter with the Beatles totally changed their lives. One guy still recalls listening to Love Me Do on a crackly radio late at night. He said it was like black and white suddenly bursting into a colorful world. Another woman described saving her wages for months to buy a smuggled Beatles record. She totally risked getting arrested just to hear Let It Be. For her, those 3 words were more than just lyrics. They were a heartfelt prayer for survival in a world that felt so suffocating. Stories like these multiplied. The Beatles weren't just entertainment, they were hope. By the 1990s, the Soviet Union was no longer the iron fortress it once had been. Economic stagnation, political discontent, and an entire generation of restless youth had begun to shake its foundations. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power, he introduced new policies: glasnost, openness, and perestroika restructuring. For the first time in decades, Soviet citizens were allowed glimpses of the outside world. Western books, films, and even music slowly trickled in. Yet, among all the cultural imports, one name already had a powerful underground legacy: the Beatles. By then, nearly every young adult in the USSR had grown up secretly listening to their songs. For them, the Beatles weren't just a foreign band, they were the soundtrack of their youth, their silent rebellion against a gray and joyless system. Even Gorbachev himself later confessed that the Beatles played a subtle yet undeniable role in changing the Soviet mindset. Their music, he said, awakened Soviet youth to the idea that life could be different, that beyond the concrete walls of communism, there was a world filled with color, freedom, and possibility. It wasn't Marxist theory or Western propaganda that first stirred those thoughts. It was the gentle strumming of guitars, the harmony of 4 voices, and the promise wrapped in simple lyrics: all you need is love. Think about that for a moment. A superpower, armed with nuclear weapons and guarded by the KGB, was slowly being undermined by songs written by 4 lads from Liverpool. Not by force, but by rhythm. Not by missiles, but by melodies. Fast forward to May 2003, the Soviet Union had collapsed more than a decade earlier. A new Russia had emerged, and with it came the freedom to embrace what was once forbidden. In Moscow's Red Square, a place once reserved for stern military parades and the shadow of Lenin's mausoleum, a different kind of gathering unfolded. Tens of thousands of people filled the square, but they weren't chanting slogans or saluting tanks. They were singing Beatles songs, loud, proud, and without fear. Paul McCartney stood on stage, guitar in hand, staring out at a sea of faces. Many in the crowd were gray-haired men and women who had once risked punishment just to hear a scratchy Beatles record on an X-ray disc. Others were young Russians who had grown up hearing stories of how their parents smuggled this forbidden music. When Paul struck the first chords of Bach in the USSR, the crowd erupted. The irony was breathtaking. A song once banned and mocked by Soviet authorities was now echoing across Red Square itself. What had once been underground resistance was now a national celebration. Some people in the audience openly wept for them. This wasn't just a concert. It was closure, a vindication of all the secret dances, the whispered sing-alongs, the risks they took in their youth. Now, standing before the Kremlin, they could finally sing without fear. One Russian man later said, "When McCartney played in Red Square, it felt like we were finally free. It was the moment we knew the Beatles had won." The concert wasn't just a performance. It was a historical exclamation point, proof that music, once outlawed, had outlasted the system that tried to silence it. So, what do we learn from this story? That music can be more powerful than censorship. That a song can slip past borders, past guards, past walls of ideology. And that, even in the darkest times, art has the power to whisper of freedom. The Beatles never intended to be Cold War warriors. But in the hearts of millions of Soviet citizens, they were exactly that. A secret rebellion. A soundtrack of hope. Proof that the Iron Curtain could never silence the human spirit. If you enjoyed this journey into the hidden history of the Beatles and the Cold War, make sure to like this video, share it with fellow history lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from the past. Because history isn't just about wars and leaders. It's about songs, ideas, and the quiet revolutions that changed the world forever.